Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Gillespie. I'm one of the board members of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center here in Tucson, Arizona, which is pleased to present tonight's program as part of Old Pueblo's third Thursday Food for Thought presentation series. And for tonight's program, Old Pueblo is delighted to present our guest speaker, archaeologist Dr. Barbara J. Roth, PhD. Dr. Roth is a professor of Department of Anthropology at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, specializing in the study of pre-contact cultures in the southwestern US. Her main research interests are the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, social changes, including household organization and gender roles that result as groups become more sedentary and agriculturally dependent, and community development in the Mimbres region of southwestern New Mexico. Barbara's directed excavations at several Mimbres region archaeological sites of the pit house period, circa 200 to 1000 CE. And more recently, she supervised excavations at the Elk Ridge site, which is the largest pueblo in the northern or upper part of the Mimbres River Valley, and is from the Mimbres Classic period, circa 1000 to 1130 CE. So in her talk tonight, she will discuss her findings of fieldwork at Elk Ridge and surrounding sites, and will explore how and why Elk Ridge played a prominent role in the upper Mimbres Valley. So please welcome this month's third Thursday guest speaker, Barbara Roth.
Thank you both. Thank you, Bill and Al. I will say in advance that this is only the second virtual talk I've given, and it's because of Al, I support what he does and what Old Pueblo does so much. And so I hope that you all use this opportunity to support his work. So I'm going to talk tonight. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see everything? Okay. Yes. So I'm going to go on, and as I say, this is not, I usually am used to giving talks to people and getting interactions. So please put questions in the chat, because I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff. One of the things that I realized when I looked at my abstract, when I started to put this paper together, is that I sounded so sure of what I was talking about. And so I want to stress from the start that this is a work in progress. And so you're probably going to see more questions than answers. I am going to talk about what we know now, but we are still pulling together all of the Elk Ridge data. So even though the abstract sounded like I was going to talk about the Elk Ridge community and where it fit, I'm going to talk about where we think it fits and where we're open to ideas. So please keep that in mind as I move through this. This is not a be-all and end-all. So first of all, for those of you who are not from the region, I'm talking about the lovely Mimbres Valley of southwestern New Mexico. And this is what it looks like. The main portion of the Mimbres area that I'm talking about is the actual Mimbres Valley. There's also the Gila River Valley, which is nearby, which you'll see on another map. But obviously the big thing there is the river. And the river gave so much of what we see happen to this region. So I want to talk a little bit, because I want to talk about communities. I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of where I became interested in communities. And so in order to do that, I have to not talk about pueblos for a few minutes, but I have to talk about pit houses, because much of my work has been focused on pit house period occupations, as Bill said. And so I did a lot of work at the Harris site in the Mimbres Valley. This is an overview of the site. This is a very large pit house village. We estimate about 200 pit houses there occupied throughout the late pit house period, from about 500 to AD 1000. And so what happened is we went there after a very famous, most of you have probably seen him before, a very famous archaeologist, Emil Howry, had excavated at Harris in the 1930s. and had really used all of his data to define what the Magillon were as a separate group in the Southwest. And so we went back there starting in 2008 and going on for many years to really look at the north part of the site. He dug the south part of the site and look at, initially what I wanted to look at was what happened when people adopted agriculture and became sedentary, and what happened to their lives. And so as a result of that, I started getting really interested in household organization, how households were organized. And then that led almost immediately to how did these communities come together? So at the Harris site, we ended up finding, and I'm going to go through this quickly, but 3 levels of organization. We found autonomous households that were living, probably family groups that were living together. But then we also found evidence of clusters of households that we interpret as extended families. And these extended families and these autonomous households lived and worked together. And we really think that that happened by integrating as a community. And that's really where I got interested in what is a community and how did these communities in the past work? Because obviously at Harris, what we found was that these groups really work together. And so here's a map of the Harris site. We have these clusters. As I say, we think that these clusters represent extended family households, but you'll also see that we have other houses there. And these were autonomous households that were living there. They were participating in the village, but we don't think that they were the landholding groups. We think that these clusters are extended family households that were landholding groups. And so I started, as we discovered this, I started thinking about, well, how did they work together? How did they fit together? What helped that? And so we started thinking about this, that these extended family groups started by AD 700. They expanded, so they were obviously successful because they expanded. We think that they were landholding. We think it was tied to irrigation. And we think that they had access to more resources. So possibly wealthier. We have abundant data to support this. I'm going very quickly because I want to get to Elk Ridge. And that they were involved in rituals. And so it was like, wow, this is a lot more complex community than we thought about before. And so we started looking some more about, like, how would you bring that community together? And one of the things at Harris we found was that one of the ways that they were brought together as a community, much like our communities today, was through ritual and through, so we found at Harris, there's a big central plaza. We think in that plaza, there were things like dances and feasts and markets and people coming together from all different sites in the valley. And then we also had these, what we call great kivas, which are structures that people would come together for rituals. And Howie had excavated 3 of these. He excavated, and they were sequentially used. So as I say, the occupation of Harris was from 500 to 1,000. And so these were sequentially used, and they got bigger, as you can see, through time. And so the one that Howie had not excavated, this was a very large, very late great kiva, and Howie excavated. You can see the results of his excavation. We didn't have the in-between to that. And so in 2013, we were actually able to excavate the middle one in the sequence. For some reason, they didn't ring it sequentially. They kind of went hopscotched. But we were able to excavate this kiva and find out that, in fact, it was used for ritual purposes. We have evidence of all kinds of ritual activities in this structure. And so what we really showed in this work from Harris is that the community consisted of these households, but that it really was brought together through communal activities, through reinforcing things that were important to these groups. And so we ended our work at Harris and we were like, oh, this is great. We're really happy. We're going to work on this. And then I got contacted by the Forest Service to do some work at a Pueblo. So let me talk about my experience with Pueblos before this happened. At Harris, the extended households that I talked about left in the AD 900s. They just moved out. They retired that big great kiva and they said, okay, we're done. And they moved out. There's a small remnant population of small households, but they were done. They did not build a Pueblo on top of that site. And so I was like, okay, I don't have to worry about this whole Pueblo thing. But other sites throughout the valley had Pueblo. They had pit houses just like this. They had great kivas. They had kivas that were retired. And then they built Pueblos on top of it. And so at about that time, the U.S. Forest Service contacted me and said, well, we have an issue at Elk Ridge. So Elk Ridge is the northernmost Pueblo, large Pueblo, I shouldn't say northernmost Pueblo, northernmost large Pueblo in the Mimbres Valley. And so I'm sure you have probably heard some of the talks on different sites, Maddox, Galaz, Swartz, Nan, Old Town, very well known. And Elk Ridge at the time was not as well known as any of the other Pueblos. And so the Forest Service approached us and said, would you be willing to do, we've got some preservation issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. Would you be willing to come and look at this? And so it was a unique setting because it is the northernmost site in the valley. And it's a unique situation because it is in an area, unlike Old Town and Galaz, which are in these lush areas of floodplain. We have floodplain, but it's also up in that area where it gets a little bit iffier to do agriculture. And so it was like, this might be interesting to look at. So here we went. Here is an overview of Elk Ridge. It's looking down at the Pueblo. The Pueblo has a long history. I will talk about that in a few minutes. We were working primarily in just this little oval right here. And hopefully you can see in that oval that there's a giant arroyo that's going through there. And the arroyo is really the reason why we were there, because the arroyo was starting to cut into the Pueblo and really damage the Pueblo. And so we were asked to come in and do some mitigation to take care of those Pueblo rooms before they were eroded. The southern half of the site, I will talk about in just a minute. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about the size of this site. And so I want to stress, I'm not going to show this slide again. So I want to stress that all of this part here is part of the Pueblo. And thankfully, because of the heavy looting in the Mimbres Valley, thankfully that is buried under large amounts of alluvium and is on Forest Service land and is protected. But we think that this was an extremely large Pueblo. And so the southern end has a little bit of a much sadder history. And that is that it looked like this. It was completely intact until 1989. And in 1989, right before the implementation of the Burial Act, the landowner decided to bulldoze it. And so he bulldozed much, or I shouldn't say much, because you can see, hopefully you can see the depth here of the alluvium. And so although he was able to destroy a lot of that portion of the site, there still remains intact parts. And thankfully, I don't know if Carl is on here, but thankfully Carl Lombach and Billy Russell and a group of very dedicated archaeologists were able to go in there after the looting and salvage so much data And that part of the site is now owned and protected by the Archaeological Conservancy. But we lost quite a bit of data during that time. And so we were just very thankful to be able to go to the north part of the site above this area, which is owned by Forest Service, and get some additional data. And I will say that we are still working with Carl and his group. They have a bunch of really important data. We're eventually going to combine it all. I will keep referring to the stuff from the south end. And so that is part of the whole process of looking at the Elk Ridge community, is looking at the entire thing. And we were actually able to link up one of our room blocks with one of Carl's room blocks. So we're going to eventually be able to really talk about this as a whole. Tonight, I'm just going to focus really on our work in the north end of the site. So the Forest Service said, oh, look, Barb, here is these pueblos are eroding. Can you come and work on this? And I'm like, okay, yeah, we can do this. And then they said, oh, by the way, we need you to go all the way to that fence line. And I was like, I thought this was going to be one season of work. So anyway, we ended up obviously 4 seasons of field work at the site. But just so to give you an idea of what we were doing, we really were trying to make sure that there was so much of the site that's still intact. And we just wanted to make sure that we got the parts of the site that were in danger. And so you'll see as I give pictures that we excavated along the edge of that arroyo all the way down to the fence line. And that fence line is the north of the fence line is the Forest Service. The south of the fence line is the private land that's now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. And so we really focused along there. And then I'm going to go, oh, I thought I had a picture of the gabions. Anyway, they would put gabions in there as we finished one area. They would put gabions to protect it. And I go out there every summer, and so far it's been protecting the rest of the Pueblo from being eroded. So we're quite happy with that. This is you can never do a project by yourself thing. So I'm giving this talk as if, oh, Elk Ridge, but that's not true. Elk Ridge is a team. And so, and I can't guarantee that everybody on the team is going to agree with everything I say tonight, and that's fine because we'll have discussions about it later. But the first thing I have, which saved me, was a co-director. This is Dr. Daryl Creel. He is the co-director of Elk Ridge. He is a well-known expert on Pueblo, Classic Mimbres Pueblos, and literally there's no way I could have done this without him. The other part of the team is the Grant County Archaeological Society volunteers. This is Marilyn Markle, Josh Reeves, Kyle Meredith. They were out there every day helping us. We literally could not have done it without them. We also have a whole team working on all this stuff I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And so again, this is a work in progress. This is Dr. Catherine Bastian. She's our bioarchaeologist. I will tell you that we did dig burials, and I will present some burial data, no burial photos, no burial ceramic photos, but the burial data have been critical in some of the interpretations we've made. This was all done with full tribal consultation because of the fact that these were in danger. They were going to, and so they will be repatriated. They're with the Forest Service now. And so this was in fire, soon to be Dr. Danielle Romero, who is working on the ceramics from Elk Ridge. We also have or soon to be Dr. Dylan Pearson, who's working on the lithics, and our MA student, Jared Miles, who's working on the more of the
Barb, you're kind of breaking up on us here.
Down the arroyo, they would put
You're muted.
all right, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, you were
I
breaking
don't
up
know
on us there for a minute.
Am I still breaking up?
No, you're good now. You need to share your screen again.
Okay, so let me get this going. Wow, that was weird. Okay. Here we go. Okay, are we good?
Yeah, you might want to go back in case we missed something. It was,
Okay, so did you hear about the Gabions, Al?
we heard about them, but the last slide you were on was of the volunteers and your staff.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so you got all them, right?
We got all
I want to
that,
make
yeah.
sure that they get, okay. So then we started excavating along the edge of the arroyo, and then they would come in with the Gabions afterwards. And so initially you look at this and you think, okay, it's some Pueblo rooms, and we continued to excavate down the arroyo. It looks, every time I show these pictures, I think, oh, it looks very neat and tidy. And then when we started pulling the data together, here's our map. Oh, look, here's one room, here's another room. But remember, what we were interested in is households and how they were organized and how they came together as a community. And so one of the things that I want to highlight is how complicated this architecture was. And I love this slide because it's a mess. And part of it was because people are messy, and people in the past behaved the same way. So people would move in. So they'd close off a doorway, they'd build a new doorway, they'd put a vent in to let some fresh air in. They'd bury somebody, they'd put another thing in. Then the arroyo came in and cut through it. And so it was very complicated architecture. We had multiple floors sometimes. Here's a nice floor here. Oh, underneath it is another floor. Underneath it was another floor. And so, and then here's just, they would partition rooms off, they would add new rooms, they would close off. So we started looking at this going, oh, how in the world are we going to parse this out? So first of all, thank God for technology. We had very detailed mapping, and we were able to start looking at how were these households organized and how might they have been organized into a community. And so once we started asking that, it kind of required us to step back. One of the first things that caused us to do this was this. Underneath one of our nice Pueblo rooms, we found a pit house. So it dated to AD 900-ish, and the Pueblo room above it dated to about 1000. And so within that construct, we saw a transition from them living in pit houses to living in pueblos. And so, but they were still there. They were still, and at the south end, they'd also found the same thing, where they'd found pit houses underneath pueblos and continuity. In this case, they'd actually used one of the same walls of the pit house to build the pueblo above it. So we saw this continuity. And so we wanted to look at how that might happen. And so we started looking at how this community of Elk Ridge might have developed. And so to do that, we had to look up. And I do mean up, because here we were along the arroyo. And up on the hill slope above us, it was a 3-circle phase. It's called the 3-circle site. a three-circle phase, which is the immediate predecessor to the Pueblo period, but a pit house period occupation. And it's a very large site. So we started looking at three-circle and we said, oh, did they just move down to Elk Ridge? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, they did move down to Elk Ridge. It's clear that some of the people that lived at Three Circle moved down to Elk Ridge. But Elk Ridge grew to be about a 200-room Pueblo. And this is not a big enough pit house site to have housed that entire Pueblo. So the community of Elk Ridge had to develop more than just from these folks moving down from Three Circles. Certainly that happened. They moved down to get closer to the agricultural land, but there was something else going on. So we began to look at what else might have gone on. Well, one of the things we started looking at as we were excavating these Pueblo rooms is like I say, we saw the complexity of the Pueblo growth over time. And in some of the largest rooms, we had multiple burials and multiple, all ages, but they were clearly buried over long periods of time. And Harry Schaefer has done some amazing work at Nan Ranch in the southern part of the valley. And he calls these rooms that were used as repeated burial rooms as lineage rooms, that these are land holding families that are marking their lineage. And we certainly see that at Elk Ridge. And so we're like, are these the initial people that are coming from Three Circle, moving down? They're the land holding families. This is my land. But then we've got other people there. Where are they coming from? Are they kin that are moving, are they related to other people in the valley? How did this community grow? And so we started looking then at these community dynamics. So the architecture points to these longstanding households, but this is a view from the arroyo. There are at least 100 Pueblo rooms out there. So obviously it's more complex than our little microcosm is. And so we think that there were people moving in, there were people moving out, the households were growing. And so it's much like any community in the world, that it's dynamic and it's complicated. And so these nice little neat Pueblo maps we make, we might need to rethink about the complexity of that. One of the other things that excited me as I looked at this, and as I looked at all the data, not just from our data, but from the stuff that Carl and Billy found in the South, is that these folks seem to be doing pretty well in terms of, even though there were large groups and it was complicated and they had to do agriculture and they had to share and they seem to have done it well. And what I mean by that is that we have plazas. We know we have plazas there. We didn't find a kiva, but we found we did some remote sensing out here. We found what may have been a kiva. It's a signature on remote sensing, so we would have to do ground testing to show that. But we think there might be a kiva. But in the South End, Billy Russell, they did find a classic period kiva. So we think that these kivas, these ceremonial rooms, were important in integrating these folks. We think the plazas where they could do dances and ceremonies and feasts were also important. But what is most important to me in looking at this community is that this worked. All this integration seemed to work because we have very, very little evidence of violence. We have some interpersonal violence, which unfortunately happens, but we don't have any evidence of really large scale violence. These guys weren't fighting with each other, except on a small scale. They weren't fighting with other villages. They were this integration, this sense of community really did seem to work. So how did that happen? Well, one of the ways we think was through feasts. We found in our excavations a burned ramada. A ramada is an external area outside pueblos. This was around a group of pueblo rooms. So it wasn't just one household, one extended family household. It was probably multiple households that were in here. We found a burned ramada with there were several vessels, but this is a very, very large vessel that we think was used for serving lots of food, just like we have today. When you have a big party, you bring everybody together, you serve lots of food. And here is a serving vessel. What is significant to us about this vessel is this right here. This has been interpreted as a Tlaloc symbol, which is a rain symbol in the Jornada region and in northern Mexico. Very rare this late in this part of the Mimbres Valley. So these guys were still perhaps buying into this ideology. We don't know. It's one pot. It's making a big assumption. It is, I will note for my student Danielle, this is the first picture of pottery I have shown in a Mimbre, and I'm giving a talk on Mimbres. And so it's very late to be showing pottery, because usually I would have shown like 900 pots by now. But it's a really important pot because it does show that they were bringing together different groups, and perhaps we're out on a limb here, that it was tied to some kind of belief system that was shared amongst those groups. And that Tlaloc symbol has been found to be that important. The other thing that we think was important was exchange. And this tied not only the Elk Ridge community to one another, but also to other groups in the region. And so one of the things that we found evidence of, and in the South End, Carl Lombach and Billy Russell found tons of evidence of, is that they are domesticating turkeys and probably trading turkeys. One of the things that I said, we have lots of questions, not as many answers as we'd like to know is how this was happening. So we found a turkey pen. Here it is. There's a little plug at the end. That's what that is. We also found multiple turkey burials. Here's the turkey that was found in the turkey pen, but we have 7 other turkey burials. And again, at the south end, they have multiple turkeys. One of the things that I have learned, I realize that whenever you do field work, you always learn things, that you can age a turkey by that little spur on the end of his leg. This is a male turkey. He's 3 years old, because you measure that and then there's some algorithm you do and they're like, okay, that's a 3-year-old turkey. So they were raising these turkeys, and we think that they were raising these turkeys to trade the turkeys, because to put the effort into making turkey pens, in the south end, they actually used Pueblo rooms for these turkeys. So they were, and we think it was probably, we found all of our turkey burials were articulated. And so we don't think they were eating them. We think it was probably for the feathers. But clearly the turkeys were important, and probably important as trade items. The thing is, if they're trading the feathers and not the actual turkeys, it may be harder to show that, to show how far they were trading. But certainly turkeys were part of this exchange network with other communities. We also know from our work and from Daryl Creel's excellent work on NA, neutron activation analysis, that they were producing pottery and exchanging pottery throughout the valley. And so we have evidence of this. Again, I don't show any pictures of burial ceramics, but we have one of our burials had one of these polychromes. This is 3-color polychrome jar. One of the burials had a beautiful example of a polychrome. So we think that there was a potter at Elk Ridge that was making these polychrome vessels. This was made at Elk Ridge. And so again, production, exchange of pottery through multiple lines of evidence looks like it was an important aspect of Elk Ridge's role, not just within its own community, but within the Mimbres Valley in general. The other thing I want to just touch on briefly, I know, I don't want to go on all night here, but is that when we talk about community, we talk about the community itself, we talk about its role in the Mimbres Valley, but we know from some of our evidence from Elk Ridge that it also participated in a larger Mogollon community. And so I want to just touch on that very briefly. It comes from a sequence of rooms that we excavated here, and particularly relates to one burial. There was a burial found in room 113, which is under 105. You'll see 105, 113, 112. There was a burial found in 113 that was a non-local man. And we know he was non-local because of the pottery he was buried with. He was buried with pottery that's indicative of the northern Mogollon groups, what we call the reserve area. And he also morphologically, physically looked very different. He was much taller. He had a very prognathic face, and he had head deformation, which none of the other burials that we found from the local groups had. And so when we first found evidence of this individual, we thought, this is interesting that he was, it looks like we had some intermarriage. What was really interesting is what happens after he moves into the village. So he moves into the Elk Ridge community, into this household, which was, by our estimation, a landholding household in Elk Ridge. And some subtle changes occur after he moves in. And we think that perhaps once he moved in, that some of his kin also moved in, which really shows us this dynamic community. And why we think that is we see some changes in later rooms. We see some architectural changes. You've seen those earlier pictures. Classic period architecture isn't beautiful. These rooms were very, very well made. These walls were very, very well made. So a little bit different architecture shows up, not everywhere, and more kind of like, hey, maybe we should try this over here. So again, some subtle changes occur as you get this interaction. And then we also have some subtle changes in ceramics. We get some smudged ware, which is very indicative of the reserve upland Mogollon potters. We get some different stylistic motifs showing up. And so we get some differences in the way they make their pottery in terms of corrugating or doing the outside. And so some suggestion that, first of all, I'm excited about this for two reasons. One is it shows that when we think about communities, we have to think a broader picture, that it wasn't just the Mimbres Valley. Yes, that was so important, but these people were participating in much larger regional dynamics. And the second thing is that it really shows how when people came in, it's like, I'm going to bring some of my family members here, and that's going to bring about some subtle changes. And how exciting to think about how, we sometimes as archaeologists think so rigidly about, oh no, you're this group or you're this group or you're this group. And sometimes those lines are a little bit fuzzy. And especially when we think about communities, you think about these people are moving in, they're moving out, they're intermarrying, they're exchanging things. And so when you start to think about that, it makes you think a little bit, like I say, I have no answers right now. I wanted it to be this nice, clear community, but there's a lot of gray in this. And it's because of the way people are and the way they interact. So what did Elk Ridge community look like? Well, another thing, so we have the Elk Ridge Pueblo, but another thing that we've been exploring, and this is the last part of my talk, the last few minutes of my talk is going to be about the stuff we've done since in 2019 and 2021, as we started thinking about what these communities might look at, like we started looking at some of these communities. So in 2019, we went to Cottonwood Pueblo, which is a mile away from Elk Ridge. It's just south. You can walk there easily from Elk Ridge. I thought it was a satellite of Elk Ridge because I thought it was small. And then we started doing work there, and it's about a 100-room Pueblo. So one of the things that we're investigating now, and we're still working on this, was this part of the Elk Ridge community? Was it, so in other words, we see that 200-room Pueblo, is that it? Or was it part of a much broader area? Or was this a group that said, yeah, I'm not really pleased with what's going on at Elk Ridge. We're going to move down the river a little bit to where we can have some access to land, and we're going to do our own thing. So one of the things we're trying to parse out right now is, was Cottonwood its own Pueblo community, or was it part of Elk Ridge? And I'm interested, I mean, we're looking at pottery, we're looking at architecture to try to see if we can see these kinds of similarities. The other thing is, there's my very lovely dog who helped with this project. We went last summer, Marilyn Markle from Grant County Art Society and Danielle Amira, my student, we went and hiked to all of the sites around this area and mapped them to try to see if we could get some GIS data, which we're still working on, to see if we can see any spatial distinctions. And this is the site of Bradsby, and this is a site that Roger Anion has been working on. And he and I have been discussing this. And where does it's right next to Elk Ridge. It's a kiva with some Pueblo rooms. And unfortunately, my dog is laying right in the middle. Unfortunately, an ATV road has now gone through it. And so we're hoping that it is going to still be there. It was up until this time, until 2021, pretty protected, but we're hoping that it's going to continue to be there. It's under that road, so it wasn't completely exposed, but we're hoping it doesn't continue to be exposed. But one of the things that Roger and I are looking at is, where does Bradsby fit into all of this? And was it, was it part of Elk Ridge? Was it people that were outside of Elk Ridge? How does it relate? So the other thing is that as we were doing our work last summer, we went to other possible communities that had pit house villages and then large pueblos and small pueblos, and we mapped all of those as well. There is, again, my dog who saw her first deer at this site, was very excited. She's a desert dog, so she didn't at first know what the heck a deer was. But we mapped all these other sites to look at, are other communities organized in the same way? And so we're pulling this all together. Again, it's our big question is, we've always looked at sites and pueblos as communities. And do we need to maybe expand that view a little bit to think about how broader communities are organized? And so, as I say, it's more a work in progress than it is an answer. Many people have been involved in this, so many people to thank. And it looks like there are at least a few questions, so I hope I went through it fast, so I hope I can answer some of them.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barb. That was great. It's good to hear you pulling everything together, even if you say it's just preliminary. It's still intriguing, still a lot of fun. I'm still processing you saying this is the second web talk you've given, and how did you do that in the past 2 or 3 years as a university professor?
Oh no, I had to teach online. I just haven't given it. It was I didn't like teaching online, so I wouldn't give webinars because I was like, yeah.
Okay.
No, I gave many web talks.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. Got a couple of questions, a couple of chats. One of them going back to the south part of Elk Ridge. How was the landowner, the one who bulldozed it, convinced to stop?
He didn't. He actually, and I don't know if Carl's on here, but Carl knows, and I think Carl's presented on this. I don't know if he's presented for you, Al, but he, part of the reason was it was just so deep and so difficult to get to those Pueblo rooms, that he did as much as he could. I mean, he did as much damage as he possibly could, given the time constraints he had. But it was actually partly, thank God, Elk Ridge is so deeply buried that it was, some of the other sites are so near the surface, but some of those Pueblo rooms are a couple of meters below alluvium. So you couldn't just bulldoze them off. You saw in that picture that you had to go really deep. So it really was time constraints because the burial law did go into effect. And once the burial law went into effect, he couldn't do it anymore. But it was really the difficulty of getting to those Pueblo rooms that stopped him from doing much more damage. He could have done much more damage. Yeah,
by the way, I don't see Carl's name among the participants too, but he gave a really good talk for the Arizona Ark and His Society a couple of years ago about
they've done amazing work there trying to get whatever information they could from that. And fortunately, I will say, the Conservancy owns it now, but there's still quite a few intact rooms there. So fortunately, it's protected now.
There's another question. Was the Tlaloc pot made at Elk Ridge?
Yes, it was. Danielle's probably going, we think it was. INAA, Newton Activation Analysis, is you identify groups that are likely to have been made. So we think that it was made. It fits the group that was made at Elk Ridge. Let's just put it that way. So we're pretty sure it was made at Elk Ridge, which is really interesting.
Here's a related question. Marilyn remarked that heard some lecturers object to the use of the term Tlaloc because it implies connection to Mesoamerican. What do you think at that point?
Well, we named it Gumby because it looks like, I don't know if you ever saw the Gumby. Yeah. Because we wanted it to be we didn't want to give it any signature, right? And so, no, I use very good point. And we're not making those connections at all. We're saying that in other areas, this is often called Tlaloc, but we're not saying this is Tlaloc by any means. We're saying that the imagery is very similar to what is found, and mostly actually in my interest is mostly found in the Jornada area, which is the Magillon group to the southeast. And so in the southeast around El Paso. And so to me, it implies more connections with them than it does to Mexico. So yes, we don't usually use that term. That's a good point.
Yeah, they're often called goggle-eyed figures.
Yes, goggle-eyed, yes. And that's more of the way that they're referred to now, because it doesn't have all that baggage with it.
You don't want to associate Gumby with Saturday Night Live in the 1980s or whatever.
Exactly. You could do that too.
Steve asked, which tribal group did you or the Forest Service receive approval from concerning the burials?
The Forest Service, it was because it was Forest Service land, it was a good point. The Forest Service was negotiating. So they worked with multiple tribes. And actually it's interesting, we could talk about this for hours, but it changed over time. Initially, it was primarily the Zuni and now the Acoma. And so, but all of the tribes were involved in it at the time. When they were initially negotiating and now as they're working on repatriating them.
Now, personally, I'm interested in what kind of repatriation plans you have and how that's progressing, but
You're going to have to talk to Chris Adams about
Okay.
that. That's not, that is a Forest Service.
Right. Chris gave a talk with the
Session.
old Pueblo not long ago. It's good. Marilyn asked, is it possible to find distinctive physical features of the man, the guy in room 107 or whatever, elsewhere in the Mogollon?
Yes, and that's one of the things, but it's so complicated because, as you know, people are variable. And so the one thing, and that's why we are not relying at all just on his physical features, because people are tall, people have big faces. But the head deformation was a big sign, but our biggest thing was what he was buried with, which was a northern pot. And so if he had just been tall and had a prognathic face, even with the head deformation, we probably wouldn't have called him non-local. But because of what he was buried with, we were a little bit more, we're still not completely sure. It's still an idea. It's interesting to us that after he moves in, after he intermarries, we do see these other changes. So it's kind of like preponderance of evidence, but no, we're not making, as I say, humans are so variable physically that you can't just say one person is representative of a distinct group. So we're just using that as one possible line of evidence.
Your bioarchaeologist just chimed in. Katie says, yes, a work in progress.
Yes. Absolutely. And as I say, we're not, there's no way, if we just had the physical evidence, there's no way we'd be talking about any of this. It's the fact that we have the archaeological evidence that goes with it.
Okay, so Brent asks Barbara, what further field work do you have planned for the next couple of years in Mimbres Valley?
We don't know yet. I'm actually going down there next week, 2 weeks. Yeah, not next week, week after. And we're going to look at a site and talk about, again, this is all group effort. It's never an individual. So we're going to go talk about possibilities. But Bob Stokes is going to be working down there. Robert Stokes is going to be working down there in the Mimbres Valley. So there's continued research going on there.
So Bruce asks, what finding or knowledge would you consider to tip the balance from separate but similar sites to interacting communities? Or is there one?
Oh, Bruce, I wish I could answer that. So that's one of the big things we're asking, is that, one of the things Michelle Hegman found, and I think that really played a big part in our ideas. Michelle Hegman found, they did a really fascinating pottery study that's published in a 2018 book on the Mimbres. Michelle Hegman and her colleagues, and they tried everything to find distinctions, and they couldn't. And what I think that's very telling. And to me, that says that, because if you were your community and you wanted to say, this is my community and I'm distinct and I'm not part of this much bigger interacting zone, you would, I make lizards on my pottery. I make, bighorn sheep on my pottery. They found none of that it was really so similar across the valley. And what that suggests to me is that there were just these networks of that there were kin, and you go visit your kin, and you go, down and stay for a while, and then you come back. And the other thing that I've really started thinking about, and I'll put a shout out to John Speth for this, because John Speth has been looking at ethnohistoric groups. He's looking at mobile hunter-gatherers, but he got me to thinking about distance and the way we think about distance. And so when I look at Elk Ridge and I look at Gawaz, I think, that's a couple mile drive. And I think people in the past didn't see distant. I mean, we think it's a lot because we're the Twinkie generation, right? And we don't walk 10 miles a day as a just part of our day. And so I think we have to stop thinking with that mind too, that long distances are not to us are not necessarily long distances in the past, and that movement and interaction between villages could have been almost seamless. And so I think that's one of the things we need to start thinking, and I really think Michelle's work has really shown that we need to start thinking about that maybe we need to come up with different parameters rather than just ceramics or certain material cultures in terms of looking at how these groups interacted. I hope that answered it. There's no answer.
Okay. So Marilyn asks, what are the implications of some people or families having more status or control because of the control of water?
And that's a big deal. And I think that's one of the, certainly, I'm going to go back to Harris because we have better data right now on Harris than that we had these families that were clearly landholding and had some level of status. And one of the ways that we really saw them working it out is by sponsoring rituals and by being involved in that ritual integration. And so I suspect that is the same kind of thing that happened at the Pueblos, is that these major landholding families, and Harry's identified them at NAN really clearly, that they were the ones that were really spearheading those integrative, hosting the dances, hosting the feasts, and really spearheading those kinds of activities that would bring everybody together. And as I say, to us, it looks like it works because we don't have that high level of violence that we have in some areas.
There's a question from Art Vokes, who'd like to know what materials did you find that have implications for long distance exchange of shell or turquoise or other things?
Well, we have, of course, the shell, as Art knows. So we have the shell coming in probably from the whole coming. It's all finished. The shell we find is finished. We don't have any evidence of manufacturing per se. We also have turquoise. Turquoise is an interesting one, Art, because we're actually looking more at our turquoise. We have a lot of chrysocolla. We're in a copper mining. The Mimbres area is a big copper mining area. And so we have chrysocolla, which is very, it looks like turquoise, but it's not the fine grain that turquoise is. And then we have this whole variability in turquoise. So turquoise is more of shell is okay. We know obsidian is coming in, mostly though from Mule Creek, which isn't that far away. So we don't have, but turquoise, we're not as certain on in terms of where it's coming from, because there is stuff locally available. And then we've got, and I'm sorry, Chris Adams isn't here, because then we've got the copper bells, and we've got abundant copper bells, but Chris has been doing all that work on that. And so again, some of that is probably local, but some of it is certainly being imported. But we don't have, it's a really interesting thing to me, is we don't have a lot of physical evidence of long distance meaning well outside the Mimbres Valley, because we don't even have a lot of non-local pottery. We have some, but we don't have a ton of it.
Okay, we're running short on questions. Someone, I believe Peter sees, wants to know if you're taking volunteers and things. He's been working with Fumi and Chris and Carl, and sounds like he's got a resume. Maybe you can get in touch with him.
If we start a new field project, definitely. Like I say, we're still in the works right now, so we're still trying to finish up this stuff.
And Marilyn's asked, who would be your specialist on the shell artifacts? I think you might have already hinted at that.
Yes, I think that, yeah, it's Dr. Vokes or Art Vokes. So,
No, that was Brent Reed who was talking about volunteering. And he just gave his contact info there in the chat. But I don't see any more, so.
I have a couple of questions.
Oh my goodness.
You mentioned irrigation several times and suggested that Harris was located where it was because of the irrigation possibilities. I know in the Mimbres Valley, very few actual irrigation features have been identified. And I was wondering if you have identified any at either Elk Ridge or at Harris, and what kind of evidence you might have for that.
no. And so let me, I will just tell you, because this is one of my favorite stories about the landowner thinking I was a freaking nut. Harris is above this really dramatic expanse of land. And the landowner had, you can see the cows out there. So I went out there and surveyed that entire thing and looking, because I'm like, I know they were irrigating out here. And it's just, there's so much disturbance. But my suspicion is that if you look at where the modern day irrigation canals are that water those fields, because this field is still in use today. You can go out there this week probably and see it planted. I think that they probably parallel those, but Al, even because we've even thought about like remote sensing, but since you have so much modern use of this area, and same with Old Town, if you go down to Old Town and look out, Old Town's at the southern part of the valley, you look out over the valley, it's just prime area for irrigation. So I don't know if maybe remote sensing technology has gotten good enough now that we could actually see it. But my concern, certainly in the Central Valley, like where Harris is, in the Central Valley, is that it's just been so many years, including like last year and this year, that it would be really hard to see. So I think we have to go with inference based on organization and location. But I'd love to do some remote sensing and see.
Yeah, at Nan Ranch, Schaefer did actually find some irrigation canals.
Yes.
And Laverne Harrington had some at Treasure.
Yeah, she has some, exactly. So there is evidence of it.
Yeah,
It's
but those
just
are pretty much in the lower part of the valley. You might want to take a look, get some consultation from Natural Resources Conservation Service, some of their soil scientists, because there have been studies. Kyle Woodson and myself have done studies relating soil phase types with possible irrigation features.
Yeah, that would be
in
great.
irrigated fields. So
And
there
that
might
would be
some
something that you
potential
could
for
go, you could go out in a field like that and do pretty easily. Yeah.
Yeah, and probably NRCS would even have good soil maps already for that area, since it is an agricultural area.
Yeah, long-term agricultural area.
Right. Another question I had is, what evidence for Pueblo rooms north of your excavation area? You mentioned there's probably several, or at least a couple of hundred Pueblo rooms there. And you mentioned some remote sensing in that area north of where you were excavating. What type of remote sensing did you do out there?
Well, he did, we contracted with somebody to do it. So they did resistivity and magnetometer, and then we actually had a drone survey done too. The drone survey, just because there's so much vegetation cover, was less informative. And again, it's all, it looks like that's what it is. You'd have to ground truth it to show. But
has there been any LiDAR work out there?
No.
Well, we got a couple more questions have come in while we were talking about both relating to birds. First, Amanda asked, were there healed fractures on the turkey bones?
And on one of ours there was, and I believe there were several from the south end that had them, but one of ours did.
And those are on wings or?
On the legs.
lakes. And Peter asked, were there any parrots? And I presume macaws found at Elk Ridge.
No. But remember, we've got limited excavations. So we didn't do any, and they did not find, though I will say they did not find any when Billy Russell did the Kiva. They didn't find any in that either. So no parrots.
Okay.
Which is interesting there too, right? Because they are prevalent in the valley at that time. But I think you have to be careful there because our sample size is small. That to say there weren't parrots out there, I wouldn't, you know, there weren't any in our excavated area.
Yeah, I had one more. You mentioned the finished shell artifacts, and the assumption is those came through the Hohokam, which I think is perfectly reasonable. Did you have any other evidence of Hohokam interaction in the area that you worked in?
Oh, great question, Al, because we've really struggled with this because, you know, there's the theory that during the pit house period, there was more Hohokam interaction and then it waned. Yeah. And no, the answer is no. We have some motifs on our pit house period pottery that are Hohokam-like. And we have tiny bit of Hohokam pottery, but no other. And you know, we have palettes, but if you look at our palettes in the Mimbres area, they're nothing like the Hohokam palettes. They're not, it's almost like they borrowed the idea, but not they didn't get the palettes because palettes are not as elaborate. They're not nothing like the Hohokam palettes I've seen. And so there's clearly some, I mean, they obviously, the Hohokam were doing the irrigation long before the Mimbres were. So were they getting ideas about irrigation? Were they getting ideas? So they obviously had some level of interaction, but it doesn't look like, at least from what data we have, that it was super sustained. I know that they have some more in the south, so maybe there's a regional difference too.
Well, in some of the sites, Nan Ranch in particular, they had cremations,
right?
But they were almost entirely located in the plazas, not in the rooms.
Right.
And
right.
You didn't excavate any plaza areas.
No, and so there's a possibility. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I had. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks, Al. So thanks again, Barbara. That was a great talk, and I love the questions and answers. There's a lot more contributed there as well. And I want to thank all the audience members that tuned in. We had over 100 people, so that's a good turnout. And I'd like to ask people in the audience to consider making a donation to help pay for Old Pueblo's Zoom subscription costs and program expenses, and to support Old Pueblo's education program. And I want to thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for asking me, Al. Good night.
I'll provide you with a copy of the chat and Q&A.
Okay, that sounds great.
And the participants list.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll be in touch. Thank you.